Putin, is very good at talking the talk and at getting in our heads and inserting fear in our heads. Nuclear fear, hybrid warfare. I mean, that's the KGB man, playbook. However, I think he's got a problem, an economic problem. He has to sustain an economy that spends 10% of the national wealth into defense. That's not sustainable.
Now, talks are taking place between Donald Trump's envoy Steve Witkoff and Kremlin officials in Florida today. It follows US meetings on Friday between Ukrainian and European officials. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State for the United States, spoke after the talks yesterday and said that he's trying to figure out a deal to keep both parties happy.
What we're trying to figure out here is what can Ukraine live with and what can Russia live with, sort of identify what both sides' positions are and see if we can sort of drive them towards each other to some agreement. Wars end generally in one of two ways. Surrender by one side for another or a negotiated settlement. We don't see surrender anytime in the near future by either side, and so only a negotiated settlement gives us the opportunity to end this war. A negotiated settlement requires two things: both sides to get something out of it and both sides to give something. And we're trying to figure out what can Russia give and what do they expect to get, what can Ukraine give and what can Ukraine expect to get. In the end, the decision will be up to Ukraine and up to Russia. It will not be up to the United States.
That was Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State. Yesterday, during his annual end-of-year TV address, Vladimir Putin said no new conflicts with the West would happen provided Europe treats Russia with respect. He also claimed that Russia wants a peaceful resolution to the war in Ukraine, but only on the condition that the root causes of the conflict were addressed. Well, joining me now is Fabrice Pothier, former Director of Policy Planning at NATO and Chief Executive of geopolitical advisory firm Rasmussen Global. Fabrice, thank you very much indeed for joining us on Times Radio. These talks that are happening in Florida, do you think there are any signs of movement from either side?
Well, I think at least you can see a real genuine effort by the U.S. president and his team to try to come to a deal. However, listening to Marco Rubio's latest statements, I think it's pretty clear that there is a piece missing, at least from the Ukrainian point of view, which is it's not just about what the Ukrainians might give in terms of concession. It's also what they will get from the U.S. and from the Europeans in terms of supporting and making these concessions acceptable. And essentially, this is what we call security guarantees here. So I think it's not just about what you get and what you give, it's also what you receive from your closest ally to make the concessions acceptable.
Yes. Well, this is interesting because, of course, one of the demands of Russia is that they want an awful lot of the Donbass region, Donetsk. And that surely is the key, there's sort of this fortress belt of cities, as they call it in Ukraine. If they give those up, then Russia can just walk straight all the way to Kiev in the future, can't they?
Yeah, I think giving the Donbass to the Russians is obviously both politically hardly acceptable for President Zelensky because basically the Russians are not occupying the entirety of the Donbass. But second, as you pointed out, at the moment the Russians can consolidate their position in the Donbass, they will be in position to exert military and all sorts of pressure on the rest of Ukraine. So it will pose, I think, it will make the military planning and defense and deterrence of Ukraine even more complex. So I think, the United States needs to be mindful that it's not just about, each side needs to do some concession. It's about what are the concessions and implications of the concessions on the long term to keep a viable and sovereign Ukraine.
Yes. And Fabrice, I mean, there is some talk that what Ukraine may get out of these talks is some promise, as you allude to, some promise of guarantees, security guarantees. I mean, this may possibly have to involve US troops on the ground, mightn't it?
I don't think this is really what we're talking about here. And I don't think it's politically anywhere close to realistic to have US forces on the ground. However, I think what is needed is to have US commitment to support European forces on the ground and B, to provide all the necessary capabilities, including intelligence capabilities, for the Ukrainians to be able to defend their territory. So it's not about U.S. soldiers on the ground, because this is politically toxic always in the U.S., but it's about having U.S. systems and capabilities in principle committed to the defense and deterrence in Ukraine.
And Fabrice, what do you make of the European Union's $79 billion loan to Ukraine? I think in theory that's meant to be over the next 2 years. Does that strengthen Ukraine's hand enough in order to get out of these peace talks something that would be satisfying to the leadership of Ukraine?
Well, I think this is better than nothing, even though it's obviously a big figure. But we have to remember Ukraine is at war. It has to hold the 1,000-plus kilometer front line. It has close to 1 million soldiers serving and defending their territory, and that costs a lot of money. So more than half of this 79 billion will go just for the war effort. However, I think this was a bit of a compromise temporary solution, because there was clearly no deal between Germany and some of the other member states, mostly Belgium, but also Italy, who didn't want basically to go and better use the immobilized foreign assets. And that's the kind of, I think, sends really a signal of weakness to the rest of the world, to Russia and to the United States, that the Europeans can't just go the extra mile and can't have unity and make the hard decision. So good on the temporary medium term, but I think it raises a big question mark about whether Europe can really step up and can have what it takes to get through this tough period.
And what did you make of Vladimir Putin's address? I believe it was 4.5 hours yesterday.
Well, I think Putin, is very good at talking the talk and at getting in our heads and inserting fear in our heads. Nuclear fear, hybrid warfare. I mean, that's the KGB man, playbook. However, I think he's got a problem, an economic problem. He has to sustain an economy that spends 10% of the national wealth into defense. That's not sustainable. He's got sanctions that are biting his economy. He has to buy. He can still buy things using, proxy economies, but they're obviously much more expensive. And then finally, he's put himself in a tough spot because he's legally annexed the Donbass. This is now written in the Russian constitution, but he doesn't control the Donbass. So he's trying to resolve that, obviously, by killing Ukrainian people, destroying cities, energy, power grid. But clearly, he's not making that much progress. So he has to solve that, but he's also unwilling to make compromises because he needs to show to the Russian people that his decision to legally annex those territories is, in fact, supported by the facts on the ground. But it's not supported by the facts on the ground. So he's playing the tough guy, and he's, a strong man. But I think to that, we should not, feel fear. He should meet strengths, not just from the Europeans, but also from the United States. And I think that's been missing all along.
Well, thank you very much indeed for all your thoughts. That was Fabrice Pothier, former director of policy planning at NATO and chief executive of geopolitical advisory firm Rasmussen Global.